in the laws of Tshuvah, the Rambam. Everyone has free will. God does not determine a person's future. He gives him the ability to make his own choices, and therefore is responsible for what he does. Because a person makes his own choices, almost always, it's appropriate to evaluate them and to regret the ones that aren't appropriate, and also use the power of free choice to do Tshuvah. And they have verses prove that this is the way a human being operates. And then he says the reason why we have to acknowledge free will is because without it, we would not be responsible for what we do. Now, yesterday when we went through this, I tried to be very careful with my vocabulary. I didn't say action by action. If you used your free will to choose that action, then you're responsible for it. And if you didn't use your free will to choose that action, you're not responsible for it. I didn't say that. I didn't say it because it's not true. I said actions have to be the result of, or coming from, or expression of free will. I didn't say action by action. You can trace it that way. And the reason is because sometimes you can choose freely an action which then puts you in a circumstance where you lose your free will. And then you do things which you don't choose. But if you knew that the first action would cause you to lose your free will, or could cause you to lose your free will, then you're responsible for what you do in the second stage because you brought it about with your free will. That's the person who gets drunk and then drives his car. While he's driving his car, he's blind drunk. But he knew he was going to get drunk, and as the pitiful advertisement in Israeli radio says, when you go out, give your keys to your friend. That's what friends are for. Meaning, for sure you're going to get drunk. That's just obvious. But at least give your keys to your friend so that you won't drive while you're drunk. And if he doesn't, and then he drives while he's drunk, and he hits something, he didn't choose to hit something. He didn't choose not to hit it either. He was drunk. But since he got drunk by free choice, he's responsible for what he does later. So it's not true that you need to make the choice now for this action now to be responsible now for this action. That's not true. But if the action now isn't the result somehow of free choice, then you're not responsible. That's the right way to put it. And he points this out by saying the Torah promises reward to the righteous and threatens the wicked with punishment. And neither punishing a person who didn't have any other choice, who couldn't have done anything else, is wicked. It's wicked and evil. And by the way, for the philosophers, I know about Harry Frankfurt stuff, and I'm just not doing that now. And responding to a righteous person by presenting him with something that's beneficial to him, when he had no other choice and couldn't have done anything else, although it's not unjust to give somebody a free gift, but it's not reward. Reward is something which by definition you earn, and he didn't earn it because he couldn't have done anything else. So since the Torah promises reward and threatens punishment, obviously the Torah is taking for granted that we do have free will. And then the Rambam asks the question, if we have free will, does it follow that we can do something that God does not want us to do? How could that be possible? Isn't God all-powerful? Doesn't He run the world? Isn't it true that whatever He wills must occur? And the careful listener will say, hey, Rabbi, you just shifted your vocabulary. First you said, I want, now you said will. That's not the same. Right, I did shift my vocabulary. And the Rambam's answer is, God's will is that we should exercise free will. And He gives us that capacity, because that's what He wants us to do. And that happens. He wills it, and it happens. We have free will, and we do exercise it. In addition to willing that we should have free will, he has preferences for what we should freely do. But given their preferences for what we should freely do, he can't guarantee that they will happen using his power, because if he guarantees the behavior happens using his power, it won't be the result of a free choice. So here's something in our description of the infinite, all-powerful deity, which in some sense he prefers, he values, he would like, and he can't guarantee it for himself. He can't guarantee it for himself because what he wants, what he would like, is our free participation. And if he would use his power, it wouldn't be free. It's a very interesting position for the all-powerful, infinite creator to be in, where there's something that he wants, which he cannot produce for himself. Still, as he says, just as God's wills that fire should rise against gravity and stones, when you release them, should fall with gravity, they're doing what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants them to do. We, in exercising free will, are doing what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to do. In addition to that, he has preferences for what we should choose. And then we will satisfy those preferences when we choose the right things, and we will violate those preferences when we do the wrong things. And we are able to do that because God wants us to make free decisions. That was almost an answer to that question. Are we together so far? Yeah? Okay, good. So then, let's hand these out. This is just one page. Well, in a certain sense, what you're saying is true. In a very deep sense, I think it's true. I explained this by using the second chapter of The Way of God by Luzzatto. It's very subtle, quite complicated, but one headline is, God created the world in order to benefit. He created the world out of his loving kindness, out of his goodness. Because he's God, he's not going to be satisfied with any less than the ideal good to give. Not going to give a substandard good, second-rate good. And since he is perfection, he is the greatest good. So to bestow the greatest good on a creature would be to bestow his own very being on that creature. That's the best the creature could have. The only trouble is that full strength is impossible. You know, the creator can't create another to be the creator because the creator is uncreated. So he modifies, and the Ramchal goes through all this reasoning. So then he says, well, he gives to the creature as much of the creator that a creature can have. And that way he does the best good for that creature. Now, put all those words together, it's one way of explaining what you said. He's making us as much in his image as a human being can be in his image, because that's the greatest good that he could possibly do for us. And the word image there is not really the right word. In Hebrew, it's not a visual term. But okay, so that I think what you're saying is deep is true in a very deep way. Question?
Well, I think you just answered it. What I was asking was like, when we say image, and does that mean more like emulating his ways?
Okay, the Rambam in the first chapter of the guide points out that the word tselem in Hebrew has no visual connotations. Tuna is picture. Toar is having a certain visual form, not tselem.
So it's more of the aspects of what God instills in us.
Yes, that's right. And the aspects that he projects himself as having, otherwise there would be no comparison between the two. And the aspects are themselves qualities.
Can you daven for, more like strength or whatever, like in a way like davening for strength against, like, let's say the Yitzhahara or something like that?
Sure, of course. 100%. Okay, now the problem that the Rambam goes on to discuss is a famous problem, and his discussion of the problem is famous, and it needs to be thought about carefully. The problem is foreknowledge and free will. If God knows the future, how can we possibly have free will? Now, perhaps the intuition is clear, there's a problem here, but defining the problem isn't easy. Defining the problem requires care. I remember that I read the 20s and 30s in the United States where religious philosophers were debating how to define the problem and went back and forth. The Rambam here is exquisitely careful, as you'll see, and he defines it the way it ended up being defined by the philosophers. They just didn't read the Rambam, that's why they took them so long. And after we see what the problem is, then we'll have to see what can be done about it. The Rambam has an approach to the problem, and there are others who have a different approach. Let's get the picture clear. Here I am making a decision. I have two alternatives, A and B, and I'm choosing which one to do. Well, it seems to me I can do A and I can do B. They're both open to me. They're both within my power. And when the time comes, I'll choose one. And when I choose to do A, I do A, and I don't do B, because I chose. I could just as well have chosen to do B rather than A. That's how we understand the way free will works. Now it seems if God already knew yesterday what I'm going to do, well, then things get problematic. There's some difficulty here. Let's read the way the Rambam defines the difficulty. One might ask, since the Holy One, blessed be, knows everything that will occur before it comes to pass, does he or does he not know whether a person will be righteous or wicked? Is that included in his knowledge? Well, the obvious answer should be yes. We credit God as being omniscient. If he knows that he will be righteous, it appears impossible for him not to be righteous. Oh. So here's the way the Rambam is setting up the problem. I'm choosing between A and B, and let's say I choose A. God knows yesterday I'm going to choose A, and in fact I am going to choose A. And I do choose A. Could I have chosen B? What would it mean to choose B? If God knew yesterday that I'm going to choose A, by choosing B, I would be proving God wrong, wouldn't I? Can that happen? Is it possible that God's knowledge should fail? God's knowledge should be mistaken? It means I can't even take seriously the possibility of doing B, because to say I have the possibility of doing B, it means I have the possibility of falsifying God's knowledge yesterday that I'm going to do A. I don't have that possibility. I don't have that power to falsify God's knowledge. Which means that B wasn't really open to me. B really wasn't within my power. Only A was within my power. Well, if only A was within my power, then my picture that I portray to myself isn't correct. The picture I portray to myself is I can do A and I can do B. They're both within my power. It's up to me to decide. Okay, I decided to do A and I chose A, but I could just as well have decided to do B and choose B. According to this reasoning, it's not true. Because since God yesterday knew I was going to do A, I couldn't have done B. I'm just making a mistake. And if free choice requires that I have two alternatives, I don't have two alternatives, I don't really have free choice. That's the way the Rambam is setting up the problem. Notice, it's not that because he knew yesterday I'm going to do A, he's forcing me to do A, he's pushing me to do A, he's causing me to do A. No. His knowledge yesterday I'm going to do A has nothing to do with how I do A. It just cuts off B. His knowledge yesterday, I'm going to do A today, means B isn't an option. And if you think of free choice as requiring having two options, you're in trouble because you don't have two options. That's what the Rambam says. Again, if he knows that he will be righteous, it appears impossible for him not to be righteous. The problem is the other side, failing to be righteous. However, if one would say that despite his knowledge, God's knowledge, that he'd be righteous, it would be possible to be wicked, no, he still could have been wicked, then his knowledge would be incomplete. His knowledge wouldn't be perfect. His knowledge wouldn't be infallible. It would be risky, because maybe he'll choose the other one. God's knowledge isn't risky, it isn't infallible, it isn't incomplete, and therefore, if he knows what I'm going to do, the alternative isn't available to me. That's the problem. Let's stop here and see whether people have something to say about this problem. Yeah.
I assume it doesn't have any effect on your free will because God, and from my perspective, used time, regardless of which point God used, let's say 2005, at the same time He used 2020. It doesn't affect what we do from 2005 to 2020. We still have the free choice to do it. He knows we're going to do it, but we still have the free choice to make that action. I don't see the issue.
Well, let's see how you answer the argument that was given. Let's go through step by step, and you tell me which step you think is incorrect and why. Okay? Step one is, yesterday he knew that I was going to do A. That's what we're saying. That's what foreknowledge means in this case. Right?
Sure.
Okay. Now, if in fact, instead of doing A, I do B, doing B would contradict God's knowledge yesterday. Wouldn't it?
If I did B, then God would have known I did B.
Oh, okay. That's one answer that others give, the Rambam doesn't give. So let's go through that. That's Saadia Gaon and the Keres Yitzchak and the Rivash and a number of others give this type of answer, but it's not what the Rambam is going to do, but let's talk about this answer. So they usually do introduce this type of answer. Here's the way the argument works. The argument is really slipping in an extra premise under the table and doesn't tell you, and then you're in trouble. When you realize there's an extra premise, then you realize that there's a way out. So, again, I really choose A, and God knows yesterday that I'm going to choose A. Now we say, what about if I did B? Is B really possible? So, let's try to be clear. When we talk about doing A and God's knowing A, we're talking about the real world, real history. These are the events that actually take place. When we talk about doing B, that didn't happen. Not going to happen. That period of time is over. It's finished. It's in the history books. So what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about a kind of alternative world, a kind of virtual universe. Let's consider a scenario, which is false. Let's consider a scenario in which I choose B. Is that a possible scenario? Could it happen? And then the person making the argument says, well, let's take a look at that world. The world in which instead of doing A, I do B. God knew earlier in that world also that I was going to do A. Isn't that a problem? He does B and he knows he's going to do A. Isn't that a conflict? Here, the defender could say, wait a minute. Why did you transfer God's knowledge yesterday of A from this world into that proposed hypothetical scenario? Who says what God would know yesterday in that scenario? Why do you assume that God's knowledge yesterday has to be transferred across? I'll explain where the intuition comes from. But once you question it, you think, hey, wait a minute. Well, must I do that? Is that important? Or is that forced on me? So he says, I think rightly, in that world where I choose to do B, what we would have to say is that in that world, God knew that I was going to do B. Not only does my action change, but his knowledge changes also. And then it's perfectly consistent. In this world, I choose A and he knew I was going to do A. In that alternative hypothetical scenario, I choose B and he knew I was going to do B. That's fine. The only way you get into trouble is by transferring God's knowledge from the real world to the scenario without change. Who said you should do that? Who says you can't do that? And here's the way to understand, by the way, Bertrand Russell, who's no friend of religion of any kind, certainly no friend of ours, thought this up 120 years ago when he published it. Don't play this game against a religious believer because it's a lousy game. He pictures it this way to make it slightly concrete. He pictures God. He says, sort of getting a sneak preview of the future. We live in a particular time. We can only see that time. But we're talking about God now, right? I'm not going outside of time as you tried to do, which I don't think you did quite consistently. But let's take it brute. Today it takes a look at tomorrow. Yesterday. Yesterday takes a look at today. What's Gottleib doing over there? He's doing A, isn't he? Okay, so now I know 24 hours earlier that he's going to do A because I saw him do it. Well, if that's how he gets his knowledge, he gets his knowledge from seeing me do it, then when you move over to the scenario where you propose that I'm doing B rather than A, there also, yesterday he looks forward and says, what's Gottleib doing? He's doing B, doesn't he? Okay, so therefore I know B. Whatever the person chooses to do, that's what God will know. The bottom line here is the person's choice causes God's knowledge. It's because I choose this. Because if you have the model of observation, when A observes B doing something, it's B's doing it that causes A to know what B is doing. That's the model of observation is where the action of the person causes the observer to know what he knows. If you say that, you can avoid the problem. You can solve the problem directly. And by the way, this has nothing to do with yesterday and today. The issue here is not foreknowledge. It's not that he knew it yesterday, even though it seems to be crucial. It's not foreknowledge. And I'll show you why, and I'll show you where the intuition came from before. The reason the question puts God's knowledge in the past is because we have this feeling, this intuition, the past is over and done with, written, set in stone, and immutable. And that being the case, we think, well, when I go to the scenario and propose that in the scenario I do B, I've got to take the same past across, because the past is not changeable. The past is not something which you can affect in any way. That's where the intuition comes from. The solution is, maybe that's not true. Maybe that's not true. Maybe what you do now can cause an event in the past. You need something like backwards causation to make this work. And that being the case, since his knowledge is dependent upon what I do, there won't be any inconsistency. Now, put God outside of time if you like, and don't say it's yesterday. Still, the same question can be raised. Does the knowledge that God has outside of time, independent of time, is his knowledge a result of what I do or not? If it's a result of what I do, we can get out of the problem. In the real world, I do A, and because God knows everything, he knows that I do A. Yesterday, tomorrow, no, outside of time. He knows it, he just knows it. But now ask, could I have done B? Well, given that in his knowledge outside of time, he has that I do A, I can't do B, because that would contradict his knowledge. Unless his knowledge outside of time comes from me. It's caused by me. I'm the one who's responsible of making it. If that's true, then of course I could do B. I did A and I caused him to know A. If I would do B, I would cause him to know B. So the same logic works whether God's inside of time or outside of time. And contrary to certain actual Jewish commentators, comes out that being in or out of time plays no role in the argument. The only crucial element in the argument is it true that God's knowledge depends upon what we do? If it does, the problem can be solved directly. As we will see, the Rambam doesn't take that way out. I'll tell you why, because before I go into what he actually says. The Rambam won't accept that, and I have a proof and I have an explanation. First of all, in the Guide of the Perplexed, Part 3, Chapter 17, the Rambam has an overview of the main schools of Arabic philosophy. The subject is divine providence and justice and so forth and so on. He gives us an overview of the main schools. And for one of them, at the end of the discussion, he says, by the way, these people believe that God knows everything, including the future, and they also believe that man has free will, and a little thought will enable you to see that that's a contradiction. Sorry, it's a contradiction. So the Rambam is not buying that way out, and Rasad Digon precedes the Rambam. And he's not taking that way out. Why isn't he taking that way out? Because, as he says in part 1 of the guide, at least 6 times, God is not mutable or affectable. Nothing causes anything as any aspect of God. God is absolutely independent. He causes, but he's not the result of any causation applying to him. Nothing affects God. He pa'alus is the way it's translated in Hebrew. He pa'alus means being affected by. He's independent of all types of being affected by. Well, this idea that I make my choice and that causes his knowledge is a grandiose effect. You're causing something in God's own, so to speak, inner constitution. The Rambam is not going to accept that. So if he doesn't accept that, he doesn't have this way out. If he doesn't have this way out, then there is no way out, and the Rambam has to have a different attitude altogether. Yeah.
Didn't we just say that our free will is the will of God? So wouldn't that randomness of our free choice be built into the system, and that would be God's will?
No, I didn't say that our free will is the will of God. If it, in the way that you mean it, if we had said our free will is the will of God, then we would have just been contradicting ourselves. Our free will means that the origin of the event is in me. We explained the word free will. What does free mean? Free, now, the word has been used and overused and misused, freedom to and freedom for and so forth and so on. But the basic meaning of freedom is freedom from. Free means free of something that otherwise would interact with you and disturb you. And here it means freedom from external causation. So to say that our will is God's will would mean that he's causing the result, and then it wouldn't be free. So we're not going to say it in that sense. Yeah.
So is God constantly looking at what we do in the future, or is he with us here? I mean, I know he's with us here, but he's clearly creating things constantly, right? But if he's doing that, then is he staying in like our time? Like, is he looking at us now, or is he looking at like the future of what we've done?
Now, I think the best picture here is to picture God outside of time, which is the official view, right? And therefore, the whole of the timeline is for him one thing. And I think, I'm dealing with somebody who wrote this up recently, I think in order to not get confused, I'm not saying to make sense of it, maybe we can't really make sense of it, but not to confuse, one should be very careful and consistent in not using any time language vis-a-vis God at all. So you're not going to say, he sees the whole thing simultaneously. Because simultaneous means at the same time. No. There's no time for God. He sees it all in one instant. No. One instant is an instant of time. No, we're not going to say that. We just use nouns and adjectives of knowledge without putting any temporal reference into it whatsoever. He just knows. That's all. And if you don't like knows because you think it's I think that's his, it's tensed, then you can say that all facts are present in his knowledge. But that's all. So, okay, so now the Rambam is faced with this problem, and he's not going to take the way out that we described. So how is he going to deal with it? So he says, know that the resolution of this question can be described as its measure is longer than the earth and broader than the sea. Many great and fundamental principles and lofty concepts are dependent upon it. However, the statements that I will make must be known and understood. In other words, I'm going to give you headlines and mostly superficial explanations, which will help you have an attitude towards it, but the depth and the explanation of them and the justification of them I'm not going to be able to do here, which he does in great expanses in the guide. As explained in the second chapter of the Laws of the Fundamentals of the Torah, the Holy and Blessed be He does not know with a knowledge that is external to him as do men, whose knowledge and selves, identities, are different entities. Rather, he, may his name be praised, and his knowledge are one. Well, let's think about that for a second. Every human being at early ages absorbs an enormous amount of knowledge and falsehood and nonsense. And then as he goes through life, discards some of it and adds more of it. The knowledge is changing continuously, and yet is always the same person. A person can have amnesia, Of course, amnesia is only loss of information about his personal history. He still knows how to drive a car. He can still use a cell phone. He still knows how to bake a souffle. Right? It's just that he loses his own personal memory. But losing that, he doesn't become a different person. It's just a person who lost his memory. Same person. So the identity of the person is in no way affected by changes in the knowledge. That means because the identity of the person is one thing and the knowledge is something else. Starts off the life. One could say that there's no knowledge there at all. The Rambam God isn't like that. Because if God and his knowledge were two, his knowledge would be infinite, his knowledge would be perfect, his knowledge would have the qualities that a deity has, and he'd be violating the unity of God. The Rambam's not going to have that. And he's not alone. Many others say the same thing. So, the first point is, we don't picture God's knowledge the way we picture our knowledge. It's different in a fundamental way. Human knowledge cannot comprehend this concept in its entirety. We'll have to worry about in its entirety. It cannot, just as it is beyond the potential of man to comprehend and conceive the essential nature of the Creator. Just as you can't understand what God is, so you can understand what his knowledge is. And here he quotes the famous verse, Moses asks God to reveal himself to Moses, and God answers, no. Ki lo yirani ha'adam v'chai. No man can see me and live. Now, if you think carefully about it and you think logically about it, he says, no man can see me and live. What about after death? Does that imply that after death you could see God? Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And the Rambam says it word for word in chapter 8 of the laws of repentance, laws of Tshuva. But while alive, it can't be done. Moses can't do it, let alone anybody else. This is an answer to Moses' request. So, sitting where we are, to understand what God is beyond our ability to comprehend, and he says, understanding God's knowledge is also beyond our ability to comprehend. This is one of the things I would put in that Isaiah meant when he said, my thoughts are not your thoughts, and nor your ways my ways. My reality is distinct from your reality, and you can't really understand it. Well, let's understand. Let's think about this. Okay, we're being told his knowledge is beyond our comprehension. Couldn't we wonder then why it should be called knowledge? It isn't like what we call knowledge, as he points out. All our experience and our content of knowledge is of a quality of a thing whose identity persists without any change, while the knowledge changes continuously. That's how we experience it. That's our name for knowledge, is that a quality like that we have. Now you tell me, oh, God has something Q, which is very different from that. Oh, okay, fine. There's lots of things that are very different from my knowledge. But then if it's really very different, why call it knowledge? It's just something else. And indeed, the next words are, accordingly, we do not have the potential to conceive how the Holy One, blessed is He, knows all the creations and their deeds. And this now seems to be like taking the previous thought and painting it black. We just don't know how. He does, we just don't know how. It seems like the problem is much more serious than that. The what of it is something which can't understand, not just how he got it, but the what of it we can't understand. So I worked on this for a while, and I asked it of my oldest son, Nehemiah, and he suggested an answer which I think is the right answer here. Suppose I said to you, just the previous. We have knowledge. For us, knowledge is this thing that we talked about. God doesn't have that. He doesn't have that. Well, let's see. If he doesn't have that knowledge, does that mean he's ignorant? Usually, if you don't have knowledge, you're ignorant. Why shouldn't I draw that conclusion? So what the Rambam is telling us is this. God can do everything that others do with knowledge. God doesn't lack any powers because he doesn't have what we call knowledge. It's just the way in which he does all those things isn't through what we call knowledge. So he's not ignorant, certainly not ignorant. But when we say he's not ignorant, it doesn't mean that he has what we call knowledge. He has something which enables him to do all the things that we do through knowledge. It's not a weakness that he doesn't have this knowledge. He has something superior to what we call knowledge. So we don't know, therefore, how he's able to do all those things which we do through knowledge. We don't know how he's able to do them because we don't know what that inner capacity is. So now, the picture we're getting of God is he doesn't have what we call knowledge. He can do everything that we can do without it, but he doesn't have what we call knowledge. Well, now let's go back to the question that we started with. The question was for knowledge and free will. The question started with, yesterday, God knew that today I would do A. He knew it. Really? Well, according to this picture, saying he knew it is not correct, because that would be attributing to God knowledge, what we call knowledge. And that's not correct. What's correct is he can do everything that we do through knowledge through something else which isn't knowledge. Well, if it isn't knowledge, then it's not obvious that there's any contradiction between when I do A, being able to do B, and not contradicting whatever that power is that God has of being able to treat the world with absolute accuracy and complete relationship with all of the facts, which knowledge would give us, because he doesn't do it through knowledge. You can't raise the problem the way the Rambam treats it, because the problem is a conflict between knowledge and free will, and knowledge has been subtracted from the table. There's a much more radical way to treat the problem, and the Rambam has all sorts of reasons why this is necessary and why it's important and why it works. The first 50 chapters of the guide are dedicated to the background to this idea, especially the last 10 there. So that's another way this is a way of avoiding the problem. What we spoke about before, where my action causes God's knowledge, a way of solving the problem. It solves the problem by pointing out that the logic of the argument is incorrect. Given that we make this picture of God's knowledge dependent upon our action, then you can show that the example of the argument doesn't work. Here we're just discarding the argument because we say you can't pose the problem. Questions up to here. Okay? So now there are people who are unimpressed by this reasoning, unimpressed by this type of approach. One thing that they say is, come on, Rabbi, you know you're stuck. You know that you haven't got an answer to the problem. So you make up this story about God's beyond understanding, it can't be known, it does it some other way. You're just promoting ignorance and promoting a failure to understand and mystery, and that's how you think that you're dealing with the problem. That's religious people are always like that. You never have anything precise. You never have anything that's described. Never have anything that can be tested. You just say we don't know, and therefore there's no problem. In science, we would never do that. No, it's not, everything's precisely defined, and you're given numbers to calculate, and we can predict what's going to show up in the instruments. Right? That's the problem with religion. Really? Well, What about light? Light behaves in various ways. Do we understand why and how light behaves that way? No, we don't. The best description we have of what's going on is quantum theory, and quantum theory says nothing at all about how and why light operates. It only predicts the outcome of certain experiments with astonishing accuracy, but why you get those results is totally unexplained. So say the top quantum mechanical physicists. We know what it does, and we don't know how and why it does it. What it does, what it does. Well, those words sound familiar now. We know what God does, but we don't know how and why He does it. There's no cheating going on there. That can be the real situation. Will we someday come to understand the way that light works? Can't rule it out. But nothing guarantees that it will happen. There are some realities that function that way. My field in philosophy was philosophy of mathematics. When I was doing the research, people were working on various different ways to understand how mathematics works. Hilary Putnam at Harvard is one of the leaders in the field, and in the 1990s he wrote a paper called Philosophy of Mathematics, Why Nothing Works. We just don't have a clue why it does what it does and how it does what it does. Look it up in the Standard Encyclopedia of Philosophy. There are 5 different schools, and each school has its strengths and weaknesses, and no one believes any of the schools, as fully adequate. Will we ever understand how mathematics works? No one could know. Maybe yes, maybe no. Is that a dodge? Is that anti-intellectual? No, that's just a fact. We use mathematics. We know the results we get when we use it, but why it's that way and how it's that way, we don't know. There's a lot going on in the world that we can't pin down. We can't really come to grips with. Quantum mechanics and relativity. I've gotten so many misunderstood emails from people about this, but yes, they conflict with one another. At present, you cannot have a consistent picture of the universe as a whole using both of them, and there's a gigantic effort trying to solve this problem, and a difference of opinion as to even which way the problem should be solved. Roger Penrose, for one, thinks that relativity is superior and quantum mechanics has to change. Many of the others think quantum mechanics is superior and relativity will have to change. Or maybe they'll both have to change because they do not fit together to give a consistent picture of the world. So do we know how the world works? No, we don't. And by the way, what about dark matter and dark energy? You may have heard of those things. The word dark there means totally ununderstood. The galaxies are held together. Some of them are rotating. Well, when you rotate, there's a force that should send things out at the tangent of the rotation. Something's holding on to them. What's holding on to them? You say, gravity, of course. Right? But if you do a calculation, how many stars there are and what their mass is and the speed of the rotation, it's not enough. It's not enough, according to standard Einsteinian theory. Given those masses and that rotation, they should be spreading apart, and they're not. Answer, there's got to be other stuff holding them together. Got to be, because otherwise the galaxies wouldn't hold together. What is that stuff? What is it made of? What is it like? What are its properties? No clue. No clue. We adopt it only because otherwise the galaxies shouldn't be sitting together. So we know it's doing this, but what it is and how it's doing it is a total mystery. And say to be true with the expansion of the universe, what's pushing it apart? Gravity ought to be pulling it together or slowing it down. Not only is it being pushed apart, but as was discovered shockingly 20 years ago, the expansion of the universe is accelerating, is expanding faster and faster. What's doing that? Oh, the answer is dark energy. What's that? That's the stuff that's pushing it apart. See? End of story, right? That's the way the scientists make fun of religion. God did it, right? So they say dark energy did it, without knowing what the dark energy is, where it came from, what holds it, what generates it. So we're in a real situation where we have two items, and by the way, the sum total of mass of the universe is 95% dark matter and dark energy. The whole of our science is a description of 5%. So is it really an intellectual dodge, anti-intellectual to say, well, there's something there and it's doing something, but I have no clue how? I don't think so. I think that a lot of science is right there, and they think of themselves as the cutting edge of human rationality. Yeah.
Dark energy and dark matter be the same thing, and it just depends on how it's reacting or what it's reacting with?
I mean,
Is that part of the
could fish and pineapples be the same thing? Probably not, because what they do is utterly different. One is a gravitational force. They think it's like gravity. It's a lot of mass, which we can't see, can interact with us. It's a lot of mass holding our galaxies together using gravity.
But like the same force, like it's pushing things apart based on the space between them, but then it changes when there's stuff close together, kind of like our gravity.
So the truth is, there was a time, maybe 70, 80 years ago, where they wanted to say that at great distances, gravity changes into a repulsive force. Now, between you and me, sometimes when the physicists talk about these things, I find the language a little hard to get around. You say, it's not two forces, it's that this force changes into another force, it changes its direction and becomes repulsive. Well, how do you explain why they're identical? If one's pulling, the other's pushing, what makes it the same? What makes it the same? So a story has to be told about that. And by the way, for those who know something about this, there are supposed to be four fundamental forces of nature. But at very, very high temperatures, they calculate that there's only one force, whatever that means exactly. There's only one, and then when things get cooler, they break down into four separate forces. Okay, fine. And then they draw the conclusion, really, there's only one. The four is only an artifact of colder temperatures, but really there's only one. The universe is unified under the one. So I asked a couple of physicists this question. Why do you take the reality from the very hot situation and say that the cold situation is artificial? Why not say that the cold situation is reality, and there are four, and then the very hot situation, artificially, it's smashed into one? Well, how did you say that the one is the reality, the other is artificial? They looked at me and said, we're not interested in that question. They went back to doing their particle physics. No. So this to me, I'm a philosopher. And this to me is just talk. There's nothing solid behind it. There's no reason to go this way. Anyway, yeah.
So, you're saying basically like dark matter and dark energy don't really, like they're unknown. Like they kind of made that up just to, like I don't know much about the topic, but they made it up because they don't know what it is that's keeping it together. Like,
Well, I think that's right. They made up the terminology because they don't know whether it's doing it, but they recognize that something has to be doing it. Because otherwise we wouldn't get the results that we get. The galaxies wouldn't be holding together. There's got to be something responsible for it. Unless you think the world is arbitrary and accidental and there are no reasons for things. But the way that science operates, when you see something happening, you say there's something behind it. It's regular and predictable. You say there's something behind it and you search for it. Right? My point is only this, that the picture that you have is there's something, yes. And do you know what it does? Some of it. That's why we're interested in it. And do you know what it is? No clue. And that's considered to be perfectly rational, perfectly okay. No critique. Just when a religious person says, we know what God does, we don't know what he is, oh, that's taking refuge in ignorance, and and it's just mysticism, and it's hocus pocus, and it's not really serious. Excuse me, you're doing exactly the same thing in physics. Yeah.
With regard to the analogy of light, physicists know how to predict how light behaves. So, what do we know to predict in terms of fashion? Like how do we can biology.
No, that's on the contrary. The fact that we can predict there and can't predict here makes the point stronger. There, even though you can predict, even though you can say what it will do, you don't know what it is and you can't explain what it does. If you couldn't predict, that would give you more leeway. You'd say, okay, look, I can't even predict what it will do, so of course it's going to be very hard for me to describe it. Something that's whose behavior I can't categorize. But here I can predict with great precision what it does, and yet I can't say what it will do. Here, with respect to something which isn't totally predictable or precisely predictable, it's much more natural to say, I don't know what it is, because it isn't predictable. Okay, so that's what the Rambam says here. Now let's just finish off the paragraph. Accordingly, we do not have the potential to conceive how the Holy One knows all the creations that are deeds. However, this is known without any doubt, that man's actions are in his own hands, and the Holy One, blessed be He, does not lead him in a particular direction or decree that he do anything. And again, lead has to mean push him and force him. This matter is known, the fact that people have free will, not only as a tradition of faith, but also through clear proofs from the words of wisdom. Consequently, the prophets taught that a person is judged for his deeds, according to his deeds, whether good or bad. There's a fundamental principle which is dependent upon all the words of prophecy. Now, I'm not going to do this in detail, but I just want to point out, there are people who tell you that they don't believe in free will. They think free will is an illusion. And in discussion, they often say, if you disagree with me, if you think free will is real, prove it. Sounds initially plausible. If I believe in something, I ought to be able to back it up. And to back it up, prove it, or at least give some good argument for it, some evidence for it. But that's not always correct. That's not always correct. There are certain things where it is appropriate to say the way in which we have it is good enough as it stands, unless you produce an argument against it. The default position here is to accept it. There is a default. It's not equal to say yes or no, and if you believe yes, show it, and if you believe no, show it. No, not all things are equal that way. Suppose the person says, I know you all believe that 2 + 2 is 4, I believe it's 5. Show me why it's 4. Prove it to me. No one in this room knows how to do that. You'd have to know formal number theory to know how to do it. There is a way to do it, but none of you knows how to do that. Do you feel like you're on the defensive? Hey, wait a minute. You know, I say it's 4 and he says it's 5. Wow, why do I say that? How could I prove that? How could I argue for? I don't know, it's so simple, it's so clear, it's like a starting point. It's, where you go from. How do you get behind 2 + 2 is 4? That's perfectly reasonable. That's perfectly reasonable. When something is obvious to everybody, and it's obvious to everybody that it is obvious to everybody else, that's perfectly acceptable as a reason to believe it, unless and until somebody comes along and challenges it. Because when you defend something, when you try to defend it and show reason to believe it, you got to appeal to something else. Well, if this thing is already at the top of the chain, it's as solid as anything you could get, where are you going to go behind it, something more solid, more reliable, and use it to defend it? Someone attacks the top of the chain, he's asking for something which is, it's not appropriate to say without further reasoning, without further evidence, you're just assuming it irrationally, you're just assuming it as a prejudice, and so forth and so on. That's not appropriate. Because reasoning asks for an appeal to something else which could support it, and then something else has to be superior in its understanding and its credibility. And in our system, there's just nothing like that. Now, Having said that, that will sound to some people as a recipe for prejudice. So just put it at the top of your system. But that's not correct, because you can foment contradictions. You could even foment contradictions at the top of a person's system. If you foment a contradiction, then there's going to be trouble. And then he might have to rethink what he's doing. I'll give you a very simple example, and I'm going to quit for today. Obviously, the world is stationary, isn't it? Isn't that obvious? So, somebody says, no, it's really moving. Are you nuts? What's the matter with you? Of course it's not moving. You're sitting on it. You know it's not moving. Okay. It's absolutely obvious that it's not moving. Now you take a pendulum, start swinging the pendulum, and let it swing for a 24-hour period. And this is what you will find. That it swings like this, and then it swings like this, and then it swings like this, and then it swings like this, then it swings like this, then it swings like this, then it swings like this. Why does it do that? Why does the arc of the swing rotate once every 24 hours? Why does it do that? Are there little mice, little ticks, and they're sort of pushing it with their wings? No, it's clean. How do you explain that? So then you say, now imagine you're doing this at the North Pole. You're holding you have your string, and you have the pendulum going like this, and you're on the Earth. What's going to happen? Well, you're going to turn around, aren't you? In 24 hours, you're going to make a rotation if the Earth is moving. And that's why it looks to you like the pendulum is moving, because you're moving around. If you don't say that, how are you going to explain it? Oh, well, I see the pendulum moving. There's no question about that. I see the arc going around every 24 hours. So now I have two things at the top of my chain. One is the Earth is stationary, obviously. And the other is that the arc goes around 24 hours, obviously. Well, now, obviously isn't going to solve it. That's how you can dislodge someone's belief, even if it's the top of his chain. This is not a recipe for just justifying prejudice. But without an attack, something that's at the top of the chain is appropriate to believe. It's justified to believe unless and until an attack comes. It is obvious to everyone that there is free will. The philosophers used the following joke to illustrate it. A philosopher who doesn't believe in free will went to the restaurant, and the waiter comes over and he says, we have here fish and meat, which will you have? And the philosopher says, listen, I don't believe in free will, I don't believe we make any choices, so I'll just sit here and wait to see what I do. Why is it a joke? Because he just decided to sit there and wait, didn't he? Everything you do presupposes that you make decisions. All your deliberation presupposes that you make decisions. You're doing this all the time. It's absolutely obvious to everyone that everyone is almost always using free will. Could it be wrong? It could be wrong. It could be wrong. But until someone comes and gives me a reason to think it's wrong, it's perfectly justified in thinking that it's right, because it's at the top of the chain. Okay, there's a lot of philosophy to go through today.
Like those type of decisions don't apply under free will, because there's always a better option of what you're going to do, so you're inherently going to pick that. It's just when it comes to serving Hashem, because it's a lot of stuff isn't necessarily what you think is going to be best for you or the situation. So when you make those decisions, you make it based on free will. But like ordering what you're going to pick what you want to eat. If your decision is you're trying to test free will, you're going to sit at the restaurant and not make a decision, and that's because you're trying to show that.
I think you are mistaken. I think you're mistaken psychologically. I think people make decisions knowing full well that they are not the best decisions for themselves. They feel guilty while they're making the decision because they know it isn't the best decision, and they freely choose to do it anyway.
But wouldn't that be under the category of not making, like,
Why?
serving Hashem because you know it's
So what? You have, as we said before, Hakadosh Baruch Hu doesn't force you to serve him. He wants you to serve him freely. And therefore he gives you the free will to choose even not to serve him. But it isn't true, you're quoting Plato and I'm quoting Aristotle. It isn't true that when a person makes a choice for himself, he does it because he believes it's best for himself at the time. That's not true. People know that it's not best for themselves and choose it anyway. If he really believed that it was best for himself at the time, he wouldn't feel guilty while he was doing it.
not just best for what you want. It's like it's your current.
Oh, sure, but that's what I want. I want to do something that's wrong. The fact that I want it doesn't mean it's not my choice.
Does that come down to serving Hashem because if it's something you know that's wrong, that is basically you're making that decision based on like that free will is because ultimately everything you do is either you're serving Hashem or not. So you're doing.
Maybe talk about the
something that's bad for
Gemara.
yourself.
The Gemara where everything is under heaven except fear of heaven.
Yeah.
Is this, how does that tap into?
That means everything that happens to you, not everything that you do. It's talking about happiness. The examples there are whether you'll be healthy or ill, whether you'll be rich or poor, whether you'll be wise or foolish, and so forth and so on. It's not. It's talk, that's because the things that you do are where you express your fear of heaven. But I'm not. I don't hear what you're trying to prove here. It sounds to me like what you're trying to prove is we really don't have free will because we always do that which we think is best for ourselves at the time, and that's just not correct. We don't do what we think is best for ourselves at the time, because if we thought it was best for ourselves, then we wouldn't feel guilty.
Well, not just what we want, so it's like a preference thing. So if we think we want to commit adultery, so we do that, but it's against Hashem's will, so that's the wrong thing to do.
But listen to what you said. You thought you wanted to, but it's the wrong thing to do. That doesn't contradict your wanting to do it. You want to do something that's wrong. Correct. You have motivations to do things that are wrong. So it doesn't contradict your wanting to do it. It's not a mistake to think you want to do it. You really do want to do it. You want to do something that's against Hashem's will. That's the Yetzer Hara. That's something which we're given. If you didn't have that, you wouldn't have free will at all. You need contradictory motivations to have free will. You're working for something, but
That's what I said. So it falls under what Hashem wants. So if it's again.
we said again, there's a difference what he wills and what he wants. He wills that we have free will. He prefers that we do one thing rather than another. And it's not what he prefers, it's what he wills us to use free will, and then he prefers us to use it one way rather than the other. So it fulfills his will that we exercise free will. It doesn't fulfill his preference that we act one way rather than another. And we said he can't have more than a preference, because to will that we act in a certain way would mean it wouldn't be free. What he's willing that we should act freely.
So it falls into basically that goes under every decision, and like every decision we make is basically free will because of that.
Okay, philosophically, I was always committed to the idea that every decision is free will. But I had students who said to me, no, only choices between good and evil are free will. Other things which seem like choices aren't choices. For other things, you're like a cat. You don't have any free will.
I mean, like buying a house?
What?
What is an example?
Well, the choice between good and evil means that you yourself define one option as good and one option as evil. You perceive it that way. So when you're choosing it, you know you're choosing between good and evil. There might be various differences between the options you're not aware of. That doesn't affect the conditions of your choice. Your choice is, in your mind, is a choice between good and evil. But if it's Wheaties or Cheerios for breakfast, and in your mind you don't see any difference between them, then it wouldn't be a choice. Your choice wouldn't be a choice between doing good and doing evil, being good and being evil, which is a choice of what to eat for breakfast. And they said, under those conditions, you don't have free will.
But that's still free will.
That my students who challenged me over the years told me that that's not free will. It's only free will when you are choosing between good and evil. So I said to them, philosophically, I don't like what you're saying. If you show me a source, a Jewish source, I'll change my attitude. If you don't show me a Jewish source, I'll say that every choice you make, every seeming choice you make is really free will. Well, they didn't find me a source. I found it. It's in the Ma'amar al Ikorim by the Ramchal, which is a brief summary of the Derech Hashem, printed at the back of some of the editions of Derech Hashem, and he says it word for word. Only when you're choosing between good and evil is it a free choice. Otherwise, you're no different from an animal. Okay, what am I going to do? That's the truth. So, rework the philosophy and so forth and so on.